I want to dive into this quick video where Jake Claver is being interviewed by Paul Barron talking about how the ETFs are going to create a lot of inflows into the XRP token, which should push the price into the double digits range. Then we've seen that he's made larger predictions in the case of a perfect storm of scenarios where if all of these things are hit, all of the money could flow into an XRP where liquidity is extremely thin, which will create for an environment where the price skyrockets to not only triple digits, but to upwards of $700+. Either way, let's have a listen.
Again, I have a full theory on all this, how it gets to extremely high prices, but it's a bunch of catalysts that all kind of culminate for the perfect storm for that to happen. If it's just the ETFs, I think
Let's do the bare minimum. Let's say we know ETFs are going to happen,
yeah,
and we're pretty much sure, we're 90% sure we're going to get a
listen
rate
on the
cut.
BTC.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think a $10 to $13 XRP would be very reasonable. Maybe even $20 to $25 XRP.
End of year or by this time next?
End of year. If we get the
End of year.
ETFs launched this year, I think that you could see that amount of liquidity move in. I think that there's going to be other things that culminate that cause it to go much higher than that. But
Right.
if it was just the ETFs, I think that those price ranges make the most sense.
And so it's not what he said, but what he didn't say. He was talking about the perfect storm, which would really just be a global debasement of fiat currencies where there is a flight of capital into other asset classes like digital assets. And XRP would be a large beneficiary of that liquidity. In other words, it would create a supply shock, right? If there's stupid amounts of demand but very little supply available, the price can go up quite heavily, creating insane market caps that you and I wouldn't believe are even possible. Either way, I don't believe it's going to happen this year, and now they're expecting it sometime potentially in March of 2026, which would elongate this bull market. However, I'm beginning to believe the bull market's actually over. And if we are going to see any levels of recovery on cryptos, it's going to be into the end of next year while we experience a bear market from now through summer. Let's listen to this gentleman by the name of Skipper talking about the reverse carry trade, the possibility for a $750 XRP, and what really might happen.
Jake Claver keeps mentioning the reverse carry trade as the main domino for his price prediction of XRP by year end. So I asked Grok AI to estimate when the reverse carry trade would unwind, and this is the answer I got. Based on current trajectories, I predict a disorderly unwind accelerating in Q1 of 2026 with the implosion, that is the rapid self-reinforcing liquidation, peaking around March of 2026. I believe Jake is just a little early, but first quarter of 2026 seems to be the logical timeline. That being said, I believe the XRP price change is going to be centered around something much more obvious, and that would be the Clarity Act. I know many are saying XRP doesn't need the Clarity Act for adoption because XRP is not classified as a security. However, I think they're missing one important point. Financial institutions are not going to adopt XRP without the full legal regulation and clarity. Therefore, the I's and T's must be dotted and crossed before institutional adoption begins. There is optimism that the Clarity Act will be passed and signed by November 22nd, just before Thanksgiving, and that will give the green light to institutional use of XRP. That also coincides with the SWIFT and ISO 20022 adoption deadline, and we don't have long to wait because it's this week. If all falls in place by Saturday, November 22nd as planned, we should see a massive move in price going forward. I've also heard from seemingly reliable sources that institutional accumulation and testing has been going on for months via private ledgers. This makes sense because these institutions are not going to adopt something as new as XRP without testing it first. I've also heard that the testing price on the private ledgers is multiples higher than even the most optimistic prediction so far. If this is all true, I think we can see an actual flip of the switch moment when XRP moves from the private ledger to the public ledger, and that price may blow the socks off of most current holders. We are so close to this supply shock.
So a lot was said in this video, and although it might sound really good, I think it's also important to pay attention to how many experts or people that seemingly know what they're talking about always give a price prediction for a certain time frame, which then ends up never happening. So if by March we do not see even a triple digit XRP, then you can write people like this off because they're not worthy of following or believing. The same can be said about a Jake Claver. Again, a very intelligent individual who has a fund and has even somehow been on some of these financial talk shows. But it's no different than a Jim Cramer. He also has a talk show and he's been wrong far more than he's been right. In other words, the markets are always going to do what they want to do and they don't care about our predictions, which means we just have to follow the market. What's the market actually telling you according to price? And the reality is you don't need to FOMO, guys. There's always another opportunity to exit or enter. Either way, I think Paul Smith explains it really well. He's followed Jake for the past several months and he's noted changes in the price prediction statements. In the past, he gave price predictions for the end of year 2025 and Q1 2026, stating with confidence prices in the 3 digits and 4 digits next year. When stating these predictions, he strongly implied that the catalyst would occur within those timeframes. Now he's hedging, trying to cover, stating that price predictions will not only occur without certain catalysts taking place. In other words, if XRP does not reach more than $10 to $15 by the end of this year, he should stop posting these videos because he will lose all credibility, to which I would 1000% agree. Everyone always has these crazy price predictions, and guess what? It gets attention. It gets you media. I'm sure people have handed their money over to him to manage, and he's earning fees. There's an incentive for him to do that. But me personally, I'm not trying to have an incentive at all, other than you joining us on this journey to become a better crypto investor, which means you don't need to believe most things you hear and see online, especially when it comes to insane price targets. If that's going to occur, the price will give you clues and indicators beforehand, which should then lead you to enter. And then if the market moves in the direction you were expecting, to double down, triple down, bet on the winning side of the market. But a lot of suckers believing this type of stuff right out the gate, even after ETF launches, are going to overinvest into a market that's likely going to continue trending down. Now, speaking on the blockchain and the ledger, even David Schwartz, the currently sitting CTO over at Ripple, who's now going to leave this position this year, stated that the XRP ledger was created in 2012, and the fact that the world of blockchain has changed many, many times over. In other words, the technology that got most companies to a large market cap or a large share of a market in 2012 have greater and newer technology. So the stuff they even developed back in 2012 is not the same as it looks right now. There needs to be constant improvement. And there are a lot of competitors in the blockchain space who are also constantly improving. It's a dog-eat-dog world. At the end of the day, the blockchain actually has to get used. In other words, if the blockchain truly gets used, and we're going to cover the XRP private ledger, but first, if the blockchain actually gets used at a massive scale and we see this great unwind where investors dump risk assets and then fly into digital assets, it is possible we'll see a double-digit XRP sometime earlier next year. But everything has to go perfectly because apparently an ETF is not enough to carry the price. And to further debunk this whole XRP private ledger type of a scenario where the price is many multiples above, there are XRP private ledgers that are used to test for banks or partners. They will use any number. In other words, they're using the same technology. It's basically like copying and pasting the code for the XRPL and saying this is private to this institutional player. They get to make the X amount of tokens they want and they can transfer those tokens back and forth at any given value. There can be way less than 100 billion tokens. Heck, they could have 30 tokens on that ledger, but that is private to them and that is completely separate from the public ledger, which is transparent and ultimately was one of the goals of Ripple as a company, to have no intermediary. Here in a post on April 8th of 2023, he has not taken it down. You can verify it by looking it up yourself directly from David Schwartz. He talks about all of the ways in which he's going to debunk these silly things that people say online, talking about stablecoins issued on the XRPL not being XRP, or XRP can't magically become a stablecoin, or the XRPL requires electricity to operate. All of these things. For example, XRP has nothing to do with ISO 222, which is actually true. ISO 222 is a messaging standard for payments. XRP is a cryptocurrency. While there could be certainly be projects using both of these things, there is no real inherent overlap between them, which means if something is ISO 222 compliant, maybe it can move through that messaging standard, but that would require demand. People would want to have to move it. There has to be real demand. But ISO 222 compliant doesn't actually mean anything for XRP. Again, he debunks that. But the thing that I'm going to cover is this statement right here, where essentially he does talk about these private ledgers. XRP and the XRPL really are what you see is what you get. In other words, the price you're currently seeing is the price based on the demand of the actual public ledger. There's not going to be a flip the switch moment where the private ledger of one bank goes and then immediately takes over the current value, because honestly, that wouldn't be right or fair. What if there's a different amount of tokens on that private ledger? And ultimately, there's just a lot of room for corruption. If you're imagining that there's some secret, massive secret, you are imagining. If you can imagine anything about anything, imagining things doesn't justify believing them. Be excited about what is actually there or builds things. And so we really just have to look at the current XRPL, which is public and transparent.